About a year ago, Women New South Wales asked myself and Professor Murakami and a team of other researchers here to begin investigating best practice in primary prevention. New South Wales has made some attempts over the last 10 or 15 years to prevent violence against women. The department's now looking to make much more serious investments in programs that would reduce physical and sexual assault against women. So our role over the last year has been to survey stakeholders in the field, interview stakeholders that are already doing this work, so that we can develop a picture for the department about the current state of play, the kind of work that's already being done, and what the department can do to support programs that have got some established evidence base showing that they're working. So if we can invest more money in them and more support, then hopefully we can augment what they're already achieving. Working with communities that have high rates of violence is really important, and there's been a strong focus on speaking to young men, teenagers and young men who might be at risk of using violence. The issue is that there are broader structural problems in those communities around poverty, disadvantage, social exclusion. Many of those problems result from government policy settings. And ultimately, we do have systems in place that tend to exacerbate the social and economic issues that affect those communities, that in turn make violence more prevalent. So there's an important aspect of prevention work that involves working with men and boys and trying to change norms and values. But I think something that has fallen through the cracks, and to some extent I think has let governments and policymakers off the hook a little bit, is that we are already intervening in the lives of those communities in a way that tends to make them more socially disorganised. It doesn't support those communities to become more cohesive, to come together to solve their problems in a way that's appropriate for them. And I think that's going to be a key issue of primary prevention moving forward. You know, what are the ways in which welfare policy is making these communities worse? What happens when we force single mums off parenting payments onto New Start when their kids turn 8? We make their financial situation much more precarious. We're currently seeing cuts to welfare services and social services, including to domestic violence services, including to homelessness services. When we do this, it has direct impacts on women's vulnerability to violence. The primary prevention agenda also needs to be speaking to another group of men, and those are policymakers. They're the men that are making the decisions a lot of the time that have serious impacts on women. And it's important actually that women's voices are being heard and listened to. Of course, you know, female policymakers have a really important role to play there. And that's why political representation for women is directly related to domestic violence prevalence. Because when we have women in positions of power making decisions that are good for women, then women are less vulnerable. And we do have a serious issue in Australia at the moment around women's political representation, particularly at a national level. Many of the decisions that are made nationally and internationally around the management of capital and investment, whether that's in the private sector or in the international aid sector, again, these decisions tend to be made by men. And this is having an impact on the kinds of investments that are being made. We do have really, good news stories. For example, in the developing world, Rwanda, I think 2/3 of their government, 2/3 of their elected representatives are women. So there's ways in which Australia is actually really trailing behind. And we do need to take deliberate steps towards doing this, because it is linked to women's health, it's linked to women's well-being, and that's a consistent finding of research since the early 1980s. I think the violence prevention agenda has had a real focus on social norms and values over the last 10 years. It's paid less attention to questions around material resources, productive resources, economic well-being, and the way in which a whole set of government policies are at the moment having corrosive impacts on women's well-being for a whole set of other reasons, as governments are pursuing other agendas, particularly around cost saving, trying to force people off Centrelink payments and into work. So they're pursuing a whole set of agendas without thinking about how does this make women more vulnerable to violence and abuse in private life. So I think that this needs to be increasingly part of how we think about primary prevention. The violence against women prevention agenda has really emerged because we know that just treating the effects is not going to work anymore. And if we're serious about this, then we're going to put in place systems and infrastructure that supports women who might be at risk of violence, but also supports men so that they don't turn to violence. Violence isn't a choice that they make anymore. If we can start to reduce the impacts of violence before it occurs, then we're looking to make impacts not just in the lives of women and children, which is of course really important, but also just right across the community and across a range of different sectors.